Is Jen Psaki trying to incite an insurrection? We're going to listen to her statement and then read it, break it down bit by bit so we can see exactly how this little terrorist is trying to take over America. Here's Jen Psaki on with The View over at ABC.
So my advice to everyone out there who's frustrated, sad, angry, pissed off, feel those emotions, go to a kickboxing class, have a margarita, do whatever you need to do this weekend, and then wake up on Monday morning, we got to keep fighting. And what that means, Lindsay, is we have to keep talking to members about federal legislation. That's essential. That's something that can be permanent, that can make sure people's rights are protected. But we also need to make sure people are educated in states across the country about what their rights are, how they can vote, when they can vote, how to request an absentee ballot. There's a lot we need to do on that front, and that's going to rely on the energy and the anger of that activism as well.
Anger and energy. And did she say the word fight? Did she say get out there and fight? Let's break down this statement. You can see from the recount over on Twitter. She says, and he gives us a verbatim breakdown of this thing, says, my advice, which sounds much like an order, to everyone out there who's frustrated, so this is going to be the angry Democrats, anybody who's sad and angry, she gets very angry, says even pissed off out there. Jen Psaki, pissed off. She says, feel those emotions. Okay, so we can see sort of a faction, kind of a movement. Some people say kind of a militia group might be forming, not sure. Says, go to a kickboxing class, which sounds very much like a training camp or a training facility. Have a margarita, so use drugs, and do whatever you need to do this weekend. Now, I don't know what that means, but whatever you need to do this weekend sounds, very, very troubling indeed. It's like, just get it done, get it out of the way, do your drugs, do the business. And then when you wake up on Monday morning, having forgotten all about that, we gotta keep fighting, she says. Fighting, fighting, fighting. So you can see we have a division, a group, almost a militia organization being prepared. We have a training camp that is being prepared as well. We've got drugs being spread around these lunatics. And we've seen a history of this before. We know very well that anytime somebody who's a politician uses the words fighting, that they must be impeached immediately because that might incite an insurrection. We have a record of this, folks. We've talked a lot about it here. This is the impeachment document from Donald Trump's, I think it was his second impeachment. It must have been the second impeachment. It was because they were very upset about this. You can see Mr. Cicilline. We've got Mr. Raskin, Mr. Nadler, and his 35-pound diaper. We've got resolved that Donald Trump is impeached. Why? For high crimes and misdemeanors. You can see that the reason they were so upset is because of this line over here. It says, things like this foreseeably resulted in lawless action at the Capitol. We have a quote here. Donald Trump said, quote, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Which is very interesting because Jen Psaki also said that when you're done with your training camp and your drugs, we're going to come back on Monday and fight, 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 fight. Now, what is she so upset about? And what is the Democratic Party so upset about? Well, the election. They said that Donald Trump is continuing to just promote this big lie, as they continue to call it, saying that he's manipulating the truth. It was the most safe and secure election of all time, but we need to change everything because it's so problematic now, just a short 2 years later. Very interesting. But we can see Jen Psaki's been asked about this a lot. He said, Jen, you are now asked to clarify the president's statement. He came out and said that he had some concerns about this 2022 election. He couldn't tell us unequivocally that it would be legitimate. We heard yesterday from Kamala Harris, same thing. She couldn't give us a clear, unequivocal answer. So, Jen, you're here to clarify the statement. How's that going to work?
Jen, during his marathon press conference, the president also suggested that the next election could be illegitimate if we don't pass voter protections. You've clarified that he was talking about Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 results. But as we speak,
I'm going to ask you next whether you agree with that statement. So before we get there, let's refresh our recollection. What did Joe Biden say? What was that statement he gave during the press conference that raised everybody's eyebrows, that made him sound, a lot of people think, just like Trump? It was this.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking of voting rights legislation, if this isn't passed, do you still believe the upcoming election will be fairly conducted and its results will be legitimate?
Well, it all depends on
All depends.
whether or not we're able to make the case to the American people that some of this is being set up to try to alter the outcome of the election. And it's one thing, look, maybe I'm just being too much of an optimist. Remember how we thought not that many people were going to show up to vote in the middle of a pandemic? We had the highest voter turnout in the history of the United States of America. Well, I think if, in fact, no matter how hard they make it for minorities to vote, I think you're going to see them willing to stand in line and defy the attempt to keep them from being able to vote.
Okay, so he goes on. We've already heard this many times, but the point is he's not giving a clear answer. Mr. President, legitimate or not? He says, well, it all depends on whether we get our agenda passed. The transcript of this, as we can see, says, oh yeah, I think it could easily be illegitimate. That was a follow-up question. Right? Imagine if Trump had succeeded. Imagine if, those attempts to say the count was not legit, you have to recount. Sure, but I'm not going to say it's going to be legit. I'm not going to say it's going to be legit, right? Depends on whether we get stuff done. The increase in the prospect of being illegitimate is in direct proportion to us not being able to get these reforms passed. If it doesn't get passed, then it's not legitimate. Jen Psaki had to come out and clean all of it up, says that the POTUS was not casting doubt, but you just heard him. And then she tries to spin it saying a record number of voters turned out in 2022 amidst the pandemic and blah, blah, blah. But this is all about the big lie. So we go back to The View. We are now up to speed. We know what the president said. We know what Jen Psaki said to try to clean it up. Let's get really clear on the question. Jen, is it this White House's position that the next election will be legitimate, yes or no?
As we speak, there are many, many state measures that would curtail the ability to vote and make it harder to vote by mail. There's 160 big lie loyalists who are running for statewide positions that would give them authority over our elections. So without reforms, why should voters have faith in the legitimacy of the next election?
Should they? Should they? Yes or no? Should they have faith in the legitimacy of the next election? Yes or no? Or is it contingent upon the reforms being passed? Because sounds awful a lot like it will not be legitimate unless you get your way. Here's what Jen says.
Well, voters should be eyes wide open and clear-eyed, and this is what the president was getting at the other night, that people are trying to make it harder for them to vote. Now, there's all the things you said, all the nefarious things you said, but also there are things like, if you're a mom and you have 3 kids and you're trying to vote and participate in the election, why not have more places where you can drop off your ballot? Why not have more days where you can go exercise your right to vote? There are things like that a lot of states are making it more difficult. So what the president was trying to convey is we need.
So she doesn't actually answer the question, as you saw, right? Why should voters think the election is legitimate? And she's actually sort of hinting that they shouldn't, saying we should all be eyes open and ears listening for any problems that might be happening out there because, as the president said, blah, blah, blah. She says it may be harder for a mom who's got a child to go do certain things. And I dug back into our election slides from 2020. And remember, we had this conversation where we say that the same activity is sort of being twisted by the parties to serve their political ends. It's emotive conjugations. Let's review how this chart works. Democrats are out now saying that there is voter suppression that is taking place. Why? Because Republicans are trying to tighten the rules. In other words, Republicans, they say, are making it harder to vote. Republicans are saying that they're focused on the quality of the votes, making sure that somebody is legitimate and should be entitled to vote and is actually voting, over the quantity of the votes. And so they don't call it voter suppression. They call it election integrity, because that's their framing on that. Democrats would say, well, that's voter suppression, because you're making it harder for people to vote. We want to emphasize more people voting. We want more people to access the polls. And they're going to say that it should be about the quantity of the votes rather than the quality of the votes. And so they frame that as being the right to vote. Everybody should vote however many times they want from whatever country they want, whether they're a citizen, whether they pay taxes, whether they're ID'd or not, it doesn't matter what it is. Everybody should have the right to vote 3 or 4 times. And you don't need to show your ID. That's the right to vote. And any attempt to impede that is going to be called voter suppression. Now, Republicans will say, when it is the Democrats arguing that everybody should have the right to vote, the emotive conjugation, the way to flip that is to say it's not about the right to vote, it's about voter fraud. Voter fraud is encouraging everybody to vote willy-nilly. And so in order to make sure we have election integrity, we now have to tighten up the rules. Got to show your ID, got to vote in your precinct. You can't, ballot harvest and mix and mingle all the ballots. And so you can see that really you can kind of put whatever you want into any one of these buckets. You can really use these to serve your ends. Jen Psaki currently is using the mom with a child, can't drop her ballot off. That's the voter suppression argument. So that's the box that they're living in. Here is what Jen continues on saying during The View.
We need to be clear-eyed, open-eyed, educated about what our rights are. We have doubled, the Department of Justice has doubled our funding and support for voter protections across the country. The Democratic National Committee will be doing a lot of work out there. But he wasn't trying to predict that the elections will be illegitimate. But he was trying to make clear to people that 2020 and what former President Trump tried to do after that election is not 60 years ago. That was less than 2 years ago. And we need to keep talking about it and make sure people understand what is going to be attempted out there in community.
Oh, my goodness. Make sure people understand what is going to be attempted out there in the community. Is she implying that this election is going to be stolen? I think that's what she's implying. Let's listen to that again.
People understand what is going to be attempted out there in community.
Wow. People understand what is going to be attempted out there in the community, which I think implies that this thing is going to be stolen, unless they win, of course, in which case then they'll be victorious. Thankfully, didn't happen again. But let's make sure that we're crystal clear on this. So we've got 3 people from the same White House, all with skepticism about the 2022 election. They've been saying for the last 2 years that Donald Trump was the monster of American democracy for even hinting that the elections were questionable. But now we've got 3 different people, all pretty important, including the president and the vice president, all saying more or less the same thing. Let's check it out.
And we need to keep talking about it and make sure people understand what is going to be attempted out there in community.
That has been offered to address the fact that around our country, states have put in place laws that are purposely making it more difficult for the American people to vote. Laws which will be felt by at least 55 million Americans, regardless of their party affiliation, their race, their gender, or their geographic location.
Well, to the point, though, because those bills were debated. The bills were debated and they didn't pass.
If I may finish, if I may finish.
But the specific question, if you don't mind, does he think, now that these bills haven't been passed, that the 22 midterms won't be legitimate or fair or free?
Let's not conflate issues. So what we are looking at, and
not going to answer it. So she doesn't think it's legitimate. And President Biden?
Well, it all depends on
So
whether or not we're able to make the case to the American people.
So the answer is no. We already heard that clip. So 3 for 3. The same people who were screaming that Donald Trump and anybody who was questioning what happened in 2020 is an insurrectionist, somebody spreading misinformation, disinformation, somebody probably who should be targeted by the FBI and the DOJ. Now it's them. They're doing the same thing. So very interesting. We're going to see if the media is going to hold them to the same standard. Is Facebook going to ban Kamala Harris or Jen Psaki or Joe Biden from any of their online accounts? I doubt it. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below, and stick around. I would love it if you subscribed. We have a live show that we do every weekday, and I'd love it if you joined us for that. So stick around. I'd love it a like before you got out of here as well, because I look forward to seeing you on the next one.